Aloha. Thanks for your consideration of the views and opinions expressed in this ThinkTech commentary, which was suggested by Ben Davis, and which we are calling Presidential Hubris on Violation of Law.
Maggie Haberman and others wrote last Saturday that our current president posted a single sentence that by afternoon he had pinned to the top of his Truth Social feed. He who saves his country does not violate any law. The saying is ascribed to Napoleon and is said to encapsulate our president's attitude on what he is doing these days. I would submit that in his hubris, our president has reversed what should be the aphorism. The aphorism should be, "He who does not violate any law saves his country." That formulation is more consistent with who we are than a vision allegedly uttered by Napoleon when he was sovereign. As our founders and framers intended, it is not the president who is sovereign in our separation of powers and federalism. It is the people who are sovereign. Our president thinks surviving 2 assassination attempts is evidence that he has divine backing to enforce his will, sort of a divine right of president's vision that no doubt plays well to his Christian nationalist base. But of course, this is nonsense.
As we all know, President Gerald Ford survived 2 assassination attempts 17 days apart in 1975. Yet, we did not see any sudden statement by him that there was magically divine backing for what he did. A year later, he lost the election, hardly a sign of divine backing, although we do know the old saying that God works in mysterious ways. This reminds me of a story of St. Augustine who was walking along the beach and saw a little girl digging a hole near the water. He asked her what she was doing. She responded that she was digging a hole to put the sea in it. St. Augustine blurted out, "That was absurd, little girl, to think you could dig a hole that was able to hold the vast sea." At which point she responded, "Well, why do you think that little head of yours can capture the majesty of God?" She then vanished, for she was an angel. Discerning the divine is not for the faint-hearted, just as Lincoln recognized when he hoped that the Union was on God's side. That the president is now seen as immune from prosecution does not mean that he needs to do things that would normally be prosecutable or subject to civil process. Lawlessness, even with immunity, is still lawlessness. It is just that it cannot be prosecuted criminally. Executive orders that may or may not contravene statutes and prior precedent may stand up because they comply with prior law, or may be dismissed as fantasy because they violate the law.
Our current president's team embraces the unitary executive theory as a rationalization for what they do. But, as we all have seen, power-hungry people always come up with rationalizations, some persuasive, some not persuasive at all, and some justified only by force. Such theories are posited as evidence of potential lawfulness of what are currently unlawful acts. They are just theories to which we are called to acquiesce or resist. It is the old wine of despots being poured into a new administration's bottle. 3 examples are noted in the article: Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus at an early stage of the Civil War, Nixonian national interest as a basis for surveillance, and post-9/11 violations of statutory limits on issues such as torture and surveillance. Lincoln took this risk at the beginning of the Civil War, yet even in doing that, he did it only when the nation was in extreme peril in a civil war. We are certainly not in that situation today. Moreover, afterward, he did not let that action be seen as a new presidential constitutional power, for he had his action ratified by Congress, the entity that did have the power to suspend habeas corpus. Nixon later spoke of Lincoln's actions during war as a basis for wiretaps, etc., when there are foreign threats. His famous theory that when the president does it, it is not illegal, a theory with a self-serving Napoleonic tinge. Yet, in his criminality, Nixon sought no congressional ratification after committing the crimes. And, in his pardon of Nixon, President Gerald Ford made it clear that presidential action could have been found to be crimes. Even though last summer the Supreme Court created a new and unprecedented concept that the president is immune from prosecution for such crimes.
As for the torture and surveillance under Bush, the Bush administration went to great lengths to get legal opinions and approvals that these actions were somehow in compliance with domestic law. And even then, there was a congressional authorization to use force. Even in this arena, a dialogue between the courts and the executive in a series of Supreme Court decisions did not lead to boundless executive power to flout the law, but rather the passage in Congress of changes in the law. Unfortunate changes, but changes nevertheless. And of course, the steel seizure case under Truman is the paradigmatic example of limits on presidential power, even when there are hostilities going on somewhere in the world, in that case on the Korean Peninsula. Our current president can declare there is a southern border emergency, or there is an energy emergency, or some other such emergency. I fully expect he will argue all manner of emergencies like that in the near future. Emboldened, he will use those political arguments of emergency to enhance his power, even though he knows that if they are challenged by someone with the requisite standing, the Supreme Court would have to find them political and thus not justiciable. But unlike the case of Lincoln, or to some extent the case of Truman or Bush, these claims of emergency lack the evidence that makes them more than just political theater. In using this Napoleonic phrase, our current president is really seeking to create a state of exception where no established rules apply. Yet, notwithstanding his error of thinking he is the sovereign, what he will find is that in a democracy it is the people who are the sovereign, and the people will not be amused by the presidential hubris of what might be called emergency declaration theater.
Thanks to Ben Davis, and thanks again to our viewers for your consideration of the views and opinions expressed in this ThinkTech commentary. We'll see you again soon for the next one. Aloha.